You know, when people ask what I did for a living before everything went sideways, I tell them the truth. I cut grass for dead people. It sounds morbid, but that's the job. Cemetery maintenance. It was honest work, and frankly, it paid better than flipping burgers. I was 24, trying to save up enough cash to get out of my parents' basement up near Albany, New York. The place was called Evergreen Memorial Park. It wasn't one of those tiny, spooky graveyards you see in horror movies, all crumbling stones and iron gates. Evergreen was huge. It stretched across 50 acres, manicured and neat, split into sections with names like Peace Garden and the Whispering Pines. My supervisor was a man named Frank. Frank was 50-something, looked like he'd been carved out of granite, and had two speeds, slow and stopped. He'd been working at Evergreen since high school. His philosophy was simple. The dead are the easiest customers you'll ever have. They don't complain about the noise, they don't argue about the bill, and they certainly don't care if you take a 15-minute coffee break leaning against a mausoleum. I liked the solitude. You spent 10 hours a day on a zero-turn mower, the roar of the engine drowning out everything but your own thoughts. It was just me, the smell of fresh-cut grass, and about 15,000 people who were done with the hassle of life. The job was mostly routine, mowing, trimming the edges around the headstones, using the weed whacker to clear the ivy that always tried to creep over the older monuments. We had specific rules. You never stepped directly on the grave markers. You always treated the plots with respect. Even Frank, who was the most cynical guy on the planet, enforced the respect rule. "They're just sleeping, kid," he'd grumble, puffing on a cigarette. "Don't wake 'em up." But even in a place where the routine was king, there were always parts of the cemetery that felt different. Evergreen was divided into two main parts. There was the new section, bright, sunny, with polished granite slabs and names that were still being added to. Then there was the old section. The old section, Section G, was where the ground got tricky. The stones there dated back to the late 1800s. They were slate and marble, stained green with moss and tilted at drunken angles because the earth had settled unevenly over a century. The ground itself was lumpy, full of depressions and mounds that made mowing a treacherous, spine-jarring exercise. We rarely used the zero-turn in Section G. It was mostly push mowers and manual labor, scraping away the weeds that grew thick around the cast-iron fences of the family plots. This story, the real story, started on a Tuesday in late October, the kind of day where the air felt heavy and wet, promising rain that never quite arrived. It was cold enough that the breath steamed when you spoke, but not cold enough for a heavy jacket, just raw and damp. Frank had me working Section G. He hated that section because of the high labor cost. But a big family reunion was scheduled for the coming weekend. Descendants of the original town founders were coming to pay their respects to the patriarch, a guy named Silas Thorne. Frank needed Section G looking pristine. "Don't rush it, Mike." Frank had warned me that morning, handing me the keys to the shed. "That ground is soft. You hit a depression too fast, you'll break an ankle, or worse, you'll crack old Mrs. Henderson's headstone. Be gentle." I spent the morning trimming the perimeter, listening to the quiet snap of the shears and the distant rumble of traffic on the highway. The silence in Section G was different from the rest of Evergreen. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the open lawn. It was a deep, smothering quiet, like the air itself was heavier. Around noon, I was working deep in the oldest part, near the thick stone wall that separated the cemetery from the municipal woods. This area was particularly neglected. The headstones were barely legible, almost completely swallowed by the earth. I was on my hands and knees, pulling out a stubborn root system that had wrapped itself around a stone angel, when I felt it for the first time. It wasn't a sound, it was a vibration. At first, I thought it was the low-frequency thrum of a heavy truck passing on the highway, amplified by the damp soil. But it wasn't steady. It was rhythmic. Thump, pause, thump, pause. It was subtle, barely noticeable, like a very slow, deep heartbeat felt through the palms of my hands pressed against the cold dirt. I froze, listening. The sound of the wind sighing through the pines was the only noise. The thrumming stopped. "Must be the cold getting to me," I muttered, shaking my head. I stood up, stretched my back, and went back to the task. firing up the weed whacker to attack a patch of overgrown ferns. The noise of the machine was loud, brutal, and reassuringly normal. I worked for another half hour, clearing the path between 2 rows of graves. Then, the machine started acting up. It wasn't dying, it was skipping, not the engine, but the actual cutting line. It felt like the head of the whacker was bouncing off something soft, something that shouldn't have been there. It felt like trying to cut through a thick, damp sponge. I shut the engine off. The silence rushed back in, painful and immediate. I looked down. The area I had just been working on was a small, flat patch of ground between 2 very old, unmarked stones. It was just earth, covered in short, patchy grass and moss. I nudged the ground with the toe of my boot. Hard-packed. Normal. But then I saw it. It wasn't the ground itself, but the moss. The thick, spongy green carpet looked like it was gently swelling. It was an incredibly slow movement, almost imperceptible, but once I focused my eyes on it, I couldn't unsee it. The moss rose slightly, maybe half an inch, like a shallow breath being taken. Then, agonizingly slowly, it deflated, sinking back down into the dirt. In. Out. My heart started kicking against my ribs like a trapped bird. My brain, the part that dealt with logic and gravity, immediately started providing alternatives. It's water. Subterranean spring. Shifting soil from yesterday's minor tremor. I crouched down again, ignoring the cold penetrating my jeans. I put my hand flat on the damp earth. That deep, slow vibration returned. Thump. Pause. Thump. Pause. This wasn't water pressure. This was too regular. It felt organic. It felt like something large and heavy was expanding and contracting directly beneath the surface. I pulled my hand back as if the ground had burned me. I stumbled backward a step, tripping over the handle of the push mower. I landed hard on my backside, scattering a pile of dried leaves. I stared at the spot. It was maybe 6 feet long and 4 feet wide. Just a patch of dirt. But it was definitely moving. Slowly, undeniably, the earth was breathing. I scrambled up, grabbing the weed whacker like it was a weapon, and backed away until my shoulders hit the cold stone of the perimeter wall. Panic is a funny thing. It doesn't always hit you as a scream or a sprint. Sometimes it hits you as absolute stillness, where your body forgets how to operate and your mind just spins in place. I stood there for a full minute, watching the earth inhale and exhale. The movement was so gentle, so slow, that if you looked away for even a second, you'd convince yourself you imagined it. But the moss was my witness. It stretched, then relaxed. What in God's name is down there? I thought about Silas Thorne, the old patriarch whose family was coming this weekend. This was his section. These were the oldest graves. I forced myself to be rational. I needed proof. I couldn't go screaming to Frank that the ground was alive. He'd think I was either high or having a breakdown, and I'd lose the job. I walked stiffly over to the shed where we kept the tools. I grabbed the longest, thickest steel probing rod we used to locate buried survey markers. It was about 5 feet long, heavy, and pointed at one end. I walked back to the spot. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the rod. I stood right on the edge of the patch of breathing ground. The rhythmic movement was more distinct now, vibrating up through the soles of my boots. It felt like standing on the chest of a sleeping giant. I lifted the rod, aimed for the center of the movement, and plunged it downward. The rod sank easily through the topsoil, maybe a foot deep, and then hit something solid. I expected the solid thing to be a coffin lid, or maybe a large root. But when I leaned my weight on the rod to try and push it further, the rod flexed. It didn't stop dead. It met resistance. But the resistance was strangely yielding, like thick rubber or densely packed muscle. And the moment I applied pressure, the breathing stopped. The ground went absolutely still. The vibration vanished. The moss held its position midway through an exhale. I held my breath, waiting for a reaction. Nothing. Silence. The normal, heavy graveyard silence. I pulled the rod out. It came free with a thick, sucking sound, the end coated in dark, rich, damp soil. I stood there, rod in hand, staring at the perfectly still earth. Had I stopped it? Had the disturbance made whatever was down there hold its breath? I waited 5 minutes. 10 minutes. The sun, weak as it was, started to dip lower, throwing long, distorted shadows across the tilted headstones. The stillness was more terrifying than the movement. It felt like being watched. I had to get out of Section G. I grabbed my tools, everything I had brought with me, and shoved them onto the wheelbarrow. I didn't care about completing Silas Thorne's plot. I needed Frank. I needed a witness, or at least a practical, boring explanation for what I had seen. I started pushing the wheelbarrow down the narrow gravel path leading out of the old section and toward the maintenance garage. I didn't run, but I moved fast. As soon as I cleared the thicket of pines that marked the boundary of Section G, I stopped and looked back. The area was already shrouded in shadow. It looked perfectly normal, quiet, and dead. But as I watched, waiting for the familiar rhythm of the breathing to return, I saw something else entirely. About 20 feet from the original spot, near a cluster of 3 small weathered stones that I hadn't even noticed before, the grass started to twitch. It wasn't the whole patch moving this time. It was localized, violent. The grass blades were vibrating rapidly, like a swarm of insects was trying to escape just beneath the surface. And then, slowly, a small mound of dirt began to rise. It looked like a mole hill, but faster and more defined. The dirt cracked open, and something pale and slick pushed its way out. I couldn't make out what it was in the failing light, but it was tubular, thick as my arm, and it was moving. It looked wet, like something that had been submerged for a very long time. It felt around blindly for a second, then quickly retreated back into the earth, pulling the dirt over the hole it had made. The ground settled instantly, the grass going still. The hole was gone. I dropped the wheelbarrow. The steel frame hit the gravel with a loud, ringing crash that echoed through the quiet cemetery. I didn't even notice the pain in my hands. I ran. I ran past the mausoleums, past the marble statues, past the endless rows of silent sleepers. I ran until I burst through the doors of the maintenance garage, gasping for air. Frank was inside, sitting at a folding table, eating a cold sandwich and reading a paperback Western. He didn't even look up. "You're early, Mike," he said, taking a slow bite of pastrami. "Section G done already? You work fast when you're motivated." I leaned against the doorframe, trying to force oxygen into my lungs. My chest was heaving. "Frank," I managed, the word coming out as a strangled whisper. "Frank, you gotta come see this." He slowly lowered his book, marking his place with his thumb. He looked at me, really looked at me, taking in the sweat, the wide eyes, the dirt on my face. "What is it, kid? Did you run over a squirrel?" "Don't worry about it. It happens." No, it's not a squirrel," I stammered, trying to find the right combination of simple words to describe something so fundamentally wrong. "It's the ground, Frank. Section G. The ground it's breathing." Frank just chewed, his expression unchanging. He swallowed the bite of sandwich, took a slow drink of his lukewarm coffee, and wiped his mouth on the back of his hand. "Breathing, huh?" he said, his voice flat. "Like what, Mike? Like it needs a ventilator?" "I'm serious. It's moving, it's rising and falling, slow and deep. And when I stuck the rod in, it stopped. And then something came out, something long and white. It pulled itself back in." Frank sighed, a long, weary sound that suggested he dealt with existential crises daily. He put his book down carefully. "Mike, you've been out there all day by yourself. That part of the cemetery, it plays tricks on people. The stones are old, the earth is soft, it's settling. That's what ground does. Settles." "It wasn't settling, Frank. It was rhythmic. I felt the pulse." Frank finally stood up, his joints popping. He was a big man, and when he moved deliberately. He didn't look scared, he looked annoyed. All right, come on. Let's take a look at your breathing ground. You show me exactly where this earth monster is hiding." He didn't bother grabbing a flashlight, even though the sun was nearly gone. He just grabbed a heavy-duty shovel, not for defense, I knew, but for digging up whatever mundane thing he was sure I had mistaken for a horror movie prop. We walked back toward Section G, Frank's pace was maddeningly slow. Every time he took a step, I wanted to sprint ahead, but I needed him to see it. I needed him to validate that I hadn't completely lost my mind. As we crossed the boundary into the old section, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. "It's right here," I whispered, pointing through the dim light toward the stone wall. Between those two big oak trees, it was the flat spot. Frank walked right up to the area, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He walked directly onto the patch of ground where I had seen the movement. He stood there for a full minute, silent, leaning on the handle of his shovel. I held my breath, waiting for the ground to start its slow, terrible respiration again, waiting for Frank to feel the vibration beneath his feet. Nothing happened. The ground was still. Perfectly, utterly still. "Well, Mike?" Frank finally asked, turning to me. "I'm standing right on it. Does it feel like I'm standing on the lungs of the earth?" I stepped closer, my heart sinking. It was true. There was no movement, no vibration. The earth was cold and solid beneath Frank's heavy boots. It looked exactly like any other piece of neglected ground in Section G. "It was just a minute ago," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "When I stuck the rod in, it stopped. Maybe it's still waiting." Frank scoffed. "It's waiting, Mike? The ground is playing hide and seek with you?" He knelt down, inspecting the soil closely. He ran a gloved hand over the moss. "I don't see anything unusual, kid. I see some old settled ground, maybe a little soft from runoff. And I see a perfectly good maintenance worker who has had one too many hours of quiet time." Then his eyes narrowed. He was looking at something I hadn't seen. "Wait a second," Frank muttered. He reached out and pointed the tip of his shovel down. "What's this?" Right near the edge of where the breathing had been, barely visible now, was a small circular depression in the earth. It was clean, about an inch wide, and looked like a fresh puncture mark. It was the hole where the pale, tubular thing had retreated. I rushed forward. That's where the thing came out. The white thing. It was fast, Frank, like a worm, but huge. Frank didn't look at me. He was staring intensely at the small hole. He leaned down, his ear close to the ground, listening. Then, very slowly, he turned his head and looked at me. The annoyance was gone. His eyes, usually squinted and cynical, were wide. "You said you felt a pulse, Mike?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "Yes." A slow thump-thump. Frank stood up, gripping the shovel handle tightly. He didn't offer an explanation. He just looked toward the woods, then back at the small hole. "Get your gear, Mike," he commanded, his voice suddenly sharp. "We're done for the day. Lock up Section G, and you don't talk about this to anyone. Not the foreman, not your folks, nobody." "But what is it?" I asked, completely confused by his sudden shift in demeanor. Frank walked past me, heading back toward the garage. He didn't look back. "I don't know, Mike," he said, his voice barely audible in the growing darkness. "But I know one thing about Evergreen. If the ground is moving, it's not because the dead are restless. It's because something that's supposed to be buried deep, deep down is trying to wake up." He stopped at the edge of the old section, the shadows swallowing him. "And we don't get paid enough to deal with things that breathe down there." He walked away, leaving me alone in the freezing, silent cemetery, standing next to a tiny hole that proved I wasn't crazy. But the knowledge that Frank, the man who treated the cemetery like a boring office park, was genuinely unnerved, that was the thing that truly chilled me to the bone. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the slow, terrible inflation of the moss, and the pale, seeking thing retreating into the darkness. I kept hearing Frank's final words, and I knew, deep down, that whatever I had disturbed was far bigger than a shifting water table. And the next morning, when I pulled up to Evergreen Memorial Park, Frank was waiting for me at the gate, already agitated. He didn't even say good morning. "Mike," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. The ground didn't stop breathing. It just moved the party. He pointed a shaky finger toward the center of the new section, the manicured, orderly part of the cemetery, the part where the ground was supposed to be perfectly flat. Look at the Peace Garden, Frank whispered. Look at the new graves. Frank didn't wait for me to respond. He was already walking toward the gatehouse, his usual slow, heavy gait replaced by a nervous, shuffling urgency. I followed him, my eyes fixed on where he was pointing, the Peace Garden. If Section G was the cemetery's forgotten attic, the Peace Garden was its showcase living room. It was right near the main entrance, freshly laid sod, expensive imported granite markers flush with the ground, and a small decorative fountain in the middle. It was designed to look peaceful and permanent, but as we drove the utility cart toward it, even from 100 yards away, I saw that permanence was dissolving. The sun was barely up, throwing long pale light across the lawn. In the distance, the ground wasn't moving with the slow, almost sleepy rhythm I had witnessed in Section G. This was faster. It looked like a massive invisible wave was rolling just beneath the surface. Imagine a huge, thick blanket laid over something restless. The grass was lifting and settling in a wave pattern that covered maybe a quarter acre. It wasn't a gentle swell. It was a noticeable, continuous ripple, like breathing had turned into heavy, strained panting. Frank killed the engine 30 feet away. We just sat there, watching. See? Frank whispered, his voice dry. I thought maybe I was seeing things. Thought maybe the cold got to my eyes. I couldn't speak. I was staring at the headstones. These weren't the ancient tilting stones of Section G. These were modern polished squares of black and gray granite, set perfectly level with the lawn. Now, many of them were visibly vibrating, not violently, but a rapid, high-frequency shudder, like a phone left on silent beneath a table. And some were definitely listing. We got out of the cart and walked onto the lawn. The sensation under my boots was immediate and sickening. It felt spongy, almost liquid, even though it looked like perfectly healthy grass. I crouched down next to a marker that read, "In loving memory of Linda S. Jensen, 1952-2021. The granite slab was tilted slightly, maybe a couple of degrees, but enough to look wrong. And running right across the corner was a spiderweb crack, starting from the edge and heading toward the engraved name. It's pushing up, I muttered. The pressure is cracking the stone. Frank knelt beside me, running a thick finger over the cracked granite. This marker was set 3 weeks ago, Mike. Solid concrete base. This shouldn't happen. It happened because whatever is moving down there is stronger than concrete, I said, standing up and looking across the rippling expanse. It's spreading, Frank. It moved from the old section to the new one overnight. And it's moving faster now. Frank stood up, his face pale beneath his usual ruddy complexion. He pulled a cigarette out of his breast pocket, but his hand was shaking too much to light it. He just stared at the spreading ripples. We can't have this, he said, his voice hard. The Thorne family reunion is Saturday. Mr. Peterson will flip if he sees this. He'll call the state, the news, the whole damn thing. We gotta fix it. Fix it? How? We can't mow it, Frank. We can't trim it. We can't even stand on it without feeling like we're surfing. We isolate it, Frank decided, finally managing to light his cigarette, inhaling deeply. We use the backhoe. We dig a trench around this area, a deep one. Maybe we can cut off whatever vein is feeding this thing. It was a desperate, stupid plan, but it was the only plan Frank could come up with that involved metal and physical labor, which was his solution to everything. We drove back to the maintenance shed and got the small yellow backhoe. It was old and cranky, but Frank knew how to handle it. I felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with pure dread. We were about to deliberately provoke whatever was beneath Evergreen Memorial Park. We drove the backhoe back to the Peace Garden. The sight of the massive machine rolling onto the pristine lawn felt like a violation, but the lawn itself was already violating the rules of physics. Frank climbed into the cab. You watch, Mike. If anything, and I mean anything, looks like it's coming out, you yell, and you get the hell out of the way. He lowered the stabilizing feet, the heavy steel pads sinking slightly into the soft, breathing earth. He revved the engine, the loud diesel roar a welcome contrast to the eerie silence of the movement. He swung the arm and plunged the heavy steel bucket into the earth right on the edge of the disturbance. The ground here, unlike the clay-heavy soil of Section G, was sandy and well-drained. The bucket tore through the topsoil easily. Frank dug down about 3 feet, pulling up clods of dirt and tangled roots. The moment the first scoop of earth was lifted, the ground complied. The breathing in the immediate area stopped instantly. The ripples subsided and the grass lay still. "See? We're draining the pressure!" Frank yelled over the engine noise, a flicker of his old cynical confidence returning. "It's just water or gas trapped down there." He dug a second scoop, 4 feet down. More dirt. He started the third scoop, pushing the bucket deeper, aiming for 5 feet. And that's when the ground fought back. The moment the bucket hit the 5-foot mark, the entire backhoe lurched violently. It wasn't a mechanical jerk. It was like the machine had hit something incredibly dense and elastic. The same yielding resistance I had felt with the probing rod, but multiplied by 1,000. The engine sputtered and stalled. Frank swore loudly, trying to restart the machine, but the key just turned in the ignition with a mournful click. The backhoe was dead. And the ground that Frank had just disturbed was no longer still. Right in the trough of the trench Frank had started, the sides of the cut earth began to bulge inward. The soil wasn't crumbling, it was being pushed by internal pressure. A thick, dark, syrupy liquid started oozing out of the disturbed earth. Not water, not oil, but something heavy and brown, smelling faintly metallic, like old pennies and decay. Then from the bottom of the trench, I saw movement. It wasn't the pale tubular thing from Section G. This was bigger. The earth in the center of the trench rose up sharply, like a fist punching through a rubber sheet. It burst open, and a mass of thick, wiry, dark tendrils erupted, whipping out of the ground with terrifying speed. They were thick as electrical cables, covered in the sticky brown ooze, and they thrashed blindly, aiming for the nearest source of heat and vibration, the stalled backhoe. "Frank, get out!" I screamed, stumbling backward. Frank didn't hesitate this time. His face was pure terror. He scrambled out of the cab, dropping his cigarette, and jumped to the ground just as the tendrils slammed against the side of the backhoe's bucket, leaving deep, scoring marks in the steel. We ran. We didn't stop until we reached the utility cart, which was parked safely on the asphalt access road a good 50 yards away. We spun the cart around and watched the nightmare unfold. The backhoe was being attacked. The tendrils, there must have been a dozen of them, were wrapping around the machine's arm and the stabilizing feet. They weren't just moving, they were tugging. The massive multi-ton backhoe began to tilt, groaning under the unseen force. The stabilizing feet were ripped free from the soft earth, and with a sickening crunch of tearing metal, the whole machine was dragged sideways, falling onto the breathing lawn. The moment the backhoe was subdued, the rhythmic movement of the earth intensified. The ripples became sharp, almost violent waves, spreading out from the point of attack. The tendrils retreated as quickly as they had appeared, pulling the heavy, dark fluid back into the earth. The gaping trench Frank had dug closed up almost instantly, the soft soil collapsing inward, leaving nothing but a large, soggy mound where the backhoe lay crippled on its side. The breathing resumed, faster now, stronger, radiating outwards like a shockwave. Frank looked at me, his face pale and slack. That wasn't a water table, Mike." "No, Frank," I breathed. "That was something that eats heavy machinery." We had just lost $10,000 worth of equipment and gained the absolute certainty that we were dealing with something monstrous and organic beneath the cemetery. Frank finally pulled out his cell phone, his hands still shaking violently. He didn't call 911. He called Mr. Peterson. Peterson was the main foreman, the guy who owned the contract for Evergreen. He was a stickler for rules, budgets, and keeping the wealthy clients happy. I could hear Peterson's voice, tinny and high-pitched, even from where I stood. He was furious. "Frank, what do you mean the backhoe is indisposed? What is wrong with you? We need that machine for the Thorn plot grading." Frank held the phone away from his ear for a second, grimacing, then put it back. "Peterson, listen to me. There's a problem, a big one. The ground is moving. It's like a seismic event, but rhythmic. And it just grabbed the backhoe and dragged it over." There was a long silence on the line. followed by a sound that could only be Peterson running a hand through his remaining hair. "Frank, are you drunk? Or are you finally having that nervous breakdown I've been predicting since 1998? You're telling me the grass attacked the backhoe. I'm telling you there are massive cable-sized roots, or tentacles, I don't know what they are, coming out of the ground and pulling things down. We need to shut the cemetery down, Peterson. We need professionals, geologists, maybe the state police." "Absolutely not," Peterson screamed. "The Thorne family is coming in 2 days. If we close the gates, they'll call the papers. This is a PR disaster, Frank. You and Mike will get a shovel, get that backhoe upright, and cover up whatever sinkhole you idiots caused. I'm driving down now. Don't touch anything else until I get there." He hung up. Frank stared at the phone as if it had personally betrayed him. "He thinks it's a sinkhole," Frank said, stuffing the phone back into his pocket. "He thinks we're idiots who backed the hoe into a soft spot." "Did you tell him about Section G?" "No," Frank said, shaking his head slowly. "He wouldn't have believed me. He needs to see the damage. He needs to see the backhoe." We waited for Peterson. The sun was fully up now, and the light made the ripples in the peace garden even more visible. It was mesmerizingly awful. The earth was a living skin, stretched over something enormous. While we waited, the movement didn't stop. It just kept spreading. We noticed the access road we were standing on, the solid asphalt, was cracking. Not the small thermal cracks you expect. These were deep fissures running parallel to the lawn, suggesting the entire subsurface was buckling. "Mike," Frank said, pointing across the road, "look at the fence line." Evergreen Memorial Park was surrounded by a decorative, low concrete wall topped with a wrought iron fence. It was solid, heavy construction. But the wall was now clearly leaning outward, away from the cemetery. The pressure from inside was literally pushing the perimeter structure apart. "It's getting bigger, Frank," I whispered. "It's growing. It's expanding." We started walking down the access road, keeping a safe distance from the rippling grass. We were looking for any sign of a boundary, any place where the phenomenon stopped. We walked past the entire length of the Peace Garden, and the ripples faded out near the central avenue. We thought we were safe. Then we heard a sound that didn't belong in a cemetery, the squeal of grinding metal. We rounded the corner and saw the main section, the area where most of the post-war burials were located. It was a vast, open expanse, and right in the middle, a row of 3 mausoleums was tilting. These weren't small monuments. These were massive structures, built of brick, steel, and marble, designed to last 1,000 years. They were built on bedrock. But the ground beneath them was no longer bedrock. The central mausoleum, belonging to the wealthy Vanderzee family, was visibly sinking on one side. The marble columns groaned under the uneven stress, and the thick iron-reinforced door was jammed and twisted in its frame. The ground around the Vanderzee mausoleum was not breathing in gentle ripples. It was churning. It was like a slow, deliberate boil, the earth rising in mounds and sinking into depressions almost simultaneously. "Holy hell," Frank muttered, removing his hat and running a hand over his bald head. "It's going for the big ones." "Why the mausoleums?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Because they're heavy," Frank replied, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. "They're anchored deep. Whatever this thing is, it's not just moving the surface, Mike. It's moving the entire substrata. It's pushing the earth out of the way so it can grow." We heard a new sound then, the high, frantic horn of a car driving too fast. Mr. Peterson arrived. He drove his pristine black Cadillac sedan right past us, ignoring our frantic hand signals, and slammed on the brakes next to the overturned backhoe. Peterson was a short, round man who always wore an expensive suit, even for a cemetery visit. He jumped out of the car, his tie flapping, and started yelling before his feet hit the pavement. "Frank, what in God's name is this mess? You wrecked the backhoe. You're going to pay for this, Frank." He didn't notice the ripples. He didn't notice the crack in the asphalt. He was focused entirely on the monetary damage. "Peterson, look around," Frank shouted, running toward him. "Forget the backhoe. Look at the ground." Peterson finally looked past the machine and saw the wide expanse of the Peace Garden, the grass perpetually swelling and settling. He stopped yelling. His mouth hung open. "What is that?" he whispered, walking cautiously onto the lawn. "It's alive, Peterson," I yelled. "It's breathing." Peterson took 2 more steps, then stopped dead. He bent over, focusing on a spot near his expensive leather shoes. The breathing was very distinct right where he stood. Peterson frowned, then reached down, probably thinking he was going to stomp out a gopher hole. He touched the grass, and the ground reacted. The ripple beneath his feet intensified sharply, becoming a tight, focused convulsion. Peterson let out a high-pitched, surprised yelp, stumbling back onto the asphalt. "It's spongy," he cried. "It feels like muscle." Before Frank or I could reach him, the focused movement didn't stop. It grew tight and small, centered right where Peterson had been standing, and then, with a sharp crack, the ground split open. It wasn't a hole opening, it was a long, jagged tear in the earth, maybe 4 feet long, and from that tear, something emerged that made the pale, retreating thing from Section G look like a housefly. It was a flap of earth, hinged on one side, that lifted up like a jaw opening. And underneath, there was no dirt, no clay, no coffin wood. There was only a solid mass of white, packed tightly together. A dense, pale, bone-colored substance, scored with thick black lines that looked like veins or roots. And the opening, the tear in the earth, was lined with rows upon rows of small, sharp, bone-white protrusions. They weren't teeth, not exactly, but they served the same purpose. They were like the teeth of a giant subterranean filter feeder. The jaw snapped shut with a sound like a wet gunshot. It missed Peterson by inches, slamming the thick flap of earth back down into place, instantly sealing the tear. The movement was so fast, so precise, that it was horrifyingly clear this was not a natural phenomenon. It was a feeding response. Peterson didn't scream. He just made a choked, gargling sound, stumbling backward, tripping over the curb and falling hard onto the asphalt. Frank and I were frozen, staring at the spot where the earth had opened and closed. The breathing, the massive, rolling, rhythmic movement, stopped entirely. Absolute silence descended upon the peace garden. The mausoleums were still tilting, the backhoe still lay on its side, but the terrible, organic pulsing was gone. It was replaced by a deep, heavy vibration that ran through the asphalt and up into my teeth. It was a soundless, massive rumble, like the entire 50 acres of evergreen Memorial Park had just sighed. A sound of satisfaction. Mr. Peterson scrambled backward, crab walking away from the spot, his expensive suit now covered in dust and mud. He was hyperventilating, pointing a shaking finger at the sealed earth. It tried to eat me," he gasped, his voice barely audible. "The ground tried to eat me." Frank finally snapped out of his shock. He grabbed Peterson by the collar and hauled him roughly to his feet. "Get in the car, Peterson, now!" Frank roared, shoving him toward the Cadillac. "We are out of here. We call the police from town." Peterson, for the first time in his life, didn't argue. He dove into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys. But as he started the engine, the Cadillac's tires resting on the newly cracked asphalt, the ground began to move again. This time, the movement didn't start with a ripple. It started with a sound, a low, grinding, subterranean scrape, like stone dragging across stone. The sound came from directly beneath the Cadillac. Frank and I watched in horror as the back tires of the sedan, the ones resting on the cracked pavement, began to sink. Slowly, inexorably, the asphalt was fracturing further, pulling the car down. "Peterson, drive!" Frank screamed, pounding on the roof. Peterson jammed the accelerator. The tires spun uselessly, digging deeper into the rapidly softening ground. The sinking stopped as abruptly as it began. The car was stuck, its rear bumper resting almost on the ground. Then the sound changed. The scraping was replaced by a rapid, wet chewing sound coming from beneath the car. Peterson was screaming now, a high, panicked sound that cut through the morning air. Frank grabbed my arm. "We can't help him, Mike. Run!" We turned and sprinted toward our utility cart, which was still parked 50 yards down the road. I didn't look back until we reached the cart. I glanced over my shoulder, my blood freezing in my veins. The Cadillac was still there, but it was listing violently to the side. The back window was gone, shattered by the upward pressure. And the trunk lid, the heavy steel of the trunk lid, was being peeled back like the top of a sardine can. I couldn't see what was doing it, but the force was immense. The metal shrieked as it was torn, and I saw flashes of that dense, pale white mass inside the trunk cavity, tearing into the upholstery. Peterson was still screaming, but the sound was muffled, trapped inside the car. Frank threw the cart into reverse and slammed the accelerator. We fishtailed wildly on the gravel path, heading straight for the main gate. As we sped away, the final, undeniable sound reached us, a sound that proved everything I had seen was true. It was a massive wet crunch, followed by a sudden, absolute silence. When we burst through the main gates of Evergreen Memorial Park, leaving the sprawling, silent, and now deeply, terrifyingly alive grounds behind us, Frank didn't stop driving. He barreled onto the highway access road, heading south toward Albany, away from the cemetery, away from the town, away from everything. He drove for 10 minutes, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, before he finally pulled over onto the shoulder of the interstate, throwing the transmission into park. We sat there, breathing heavily, the roar of the morning traffic loud and blessedly normal around us. "We just left him," I whispered, the reality of it hitting me like a physical blow. "We left Peterson." Frank stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the distant skyline. "Peterson is gone, Mike," Frank said, his voice flat, exhausted. "And nobody is going to believe us. The police will think we killed him and buried him under the backhoe. They'll find the car and they'll find whatever is left of him." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "What in God's name is that thing, Frank?" I asked, looking back toward the distant, tree-lined boundary of Evergreen. Frank finally turned to me. His face was etched with a profound, bone-deep horror. "I told you, Mike," he said, shaking his head. "I worked this place since high school. I know the history. We weren't cutting grass over bodies, Mike. We were cutting grass over something else entirely." He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a battered laminated map, an old survey of Evergreen Memorial Park, dating back to the 1920s. "Remember Silas Thorne?" Frank asked, pointing to Section G, the oldest part. "The patriarch, they're having the reunion for this weekend. He was the original landowner. But the reason the cemetery bought this land in the first place wasn't because it was cheap farm ground." Frank traced the boundary lines of Section G with a trembling finger. "This entire area, Mike, the old section, the Peace Garden, all 50 acres. It was a quarantine zone." He flipped the map over. On the back, handwritten in fading ink, was a cryptic note. "Site of the Great Blight. Sealed 1891. No excavation below 4 feet. No disturbance of the root structure." "The Blight," Frank whispered, looking at the distant cemetery. "That's what they called it back then. They said it killed the livestock, it killed the crops, and it killed the people. Whatever it wasn't a disease. It was something that grew. And the city fathers, they didn't know how to stop it, so they buried it. Deep. They covered it with earth, paved over it, and sold it as a cemetery." Frank folded the map and put it away. He started the utility cart. "We have to go back, Mike," he said, pulling back onto the road. "Go back? Frank, it just ate our boss." "We can't call the police," Frank insisted, his eyes blazing with a desperate resolve. "They won't believe us, and they won't be able to stop it. We saw what happens when you disturb it. It eats the disturbance. But we know the history. We know the original weakness." He sped up, leaving the traffic behind, heading straight toward the Albany County Archives building downtown. "We need to find out exactly what the blight was, Mike," Frank declared, gripping the wheel. "And we need to know what they used to seal it. Because if that thing is fully awake, if it's expanding like this, it won't stop at the cemetery fence. It's going to start eating the town." The silence of the dead was over. We had woken the monster beneath the grass, and now, the only way to survive was to dig up the secrets the founders of Evergreen Memorial Park had tried to bury forever. Our fight had just begun, and we were 2 groundskeepers against an entire hungry graveyard. We barreled onto the highway, leaving the nightmare of Evergreen Memorial Park shrinking in the rearview mirror. Frank didn't slow down until we hit the outskirts of Albany. "We have to go back, Mike," Frank had said, his voice raw. And he was right. We couldn't just tell the cops that the ground ate our boss. We were groundskeepers. That story ends with us in handcuffs, facing a murder charge because we couldn't explain the missing body or the mangled car. We needed the truth, and we needed a weapon. Frank drove the utility cart right up to the back door of the Albany County Archives building. It was barely 8 a.m. and the main doors were locked, but Frank knew the rhythm of the city's bureaucracy. "Stay here," he ordered, jumping out. He found a maintenance worker drinking coffee outside a loading dock and, using a combination of fast talking, a fake plumbing emergency story, and a $20 bill, he got the guy to unlock a rarely used service entrance. We slipped inside, the fluorescent lights of the deserted basement archives buzzing loudly, a welcome contrast to the organic silence of the cemetery. Frank led me straight to the microfiche room, heading for the oldest city planning records. He knew exactly where to look. "The blight," Frank muttered, feeding a reel into the reader. It wasn't a disease they were trying to hide. It was the reason they needed to bury everything so deep. We spent the next hour scanning brittle, yellowed documents from the 1890s. The records were sparse, censored, and written in the overly formal language of the Victorian era, but the message was clear. The land that became Evergreen Memorial Park had once been the site of a disaster they called the Great Blight. It wasn't cholera or typhoid. It was a rapid, aggressive growth that consumed everything organic. Trees, crops, livestock, they were all pulled down and absorbed by a subterranean network. The reports described massive, pale roots and ground that heaved like a sleeping beast. The city fathers, led by Silas Thorne, the patriarch whose plot was in Section G, didn't manage to kill it. They managed to seal it. We finally found the key on a badly faded engineering sketch. It was a cross-section of the original quarantine site. "Look," Frank whispered, pointing to a central point marked with an X directly beneath the area that would become Section G. The core. The drawing showed a massive, deep pit, dug long before the cemetery was established. Into this pit, they had dumped tons of industrial rock salt and calcium carbonate, lime, the strongest chemical inhibitors available at the time. The idea was to create a central core of pure poison that would slowly leach into the surrounding earth, keeping the massive dormant root structure inert. The note was stark. The blight cannot tolerate high salinity. The core must never be breached or disturbed, for the system will seek to flush the poison and restore its growth cycle. "It's dissolving," I realized, the terror rushing back. After 130 years, the salt core is finally breaking down. And when I stuck the probing rod in yesterday, and when we dug the trench today, we didn't just disturb it, Frank. We gave it a pathway to expand and a reason to fight. The breathing was the creature's attempt to circulate fluids, to flush the remaining poison and rehydrate its network. The pale tubular thing I saw, that was a scout testing the ground. The thing that ate Peterson? That was a defensive response to a direct threat near its central system. "We have to replace the core," Frank said, slamming his hand on the table. "We have to repoison it. And we have to do it exactly where Silas Thorne is buried." We left the archives, our minds racing, the urgency of the moment eclipsing the horror of what we had just witnessed. We were racing against a biological time bomb. We stopped at a local hardware supply store that was just opening. We didn't bother with subtlety. We bought every bag of road salt, pool shock, and industrial-strength lime we could load onto the utility cart. We looked like two panicked survivalists preparing for an apocalyptic ice storm. The final item was a rented industrial earth auger, a powerful, gasoline-powered drill designed for boring fence posts. It was loud, heavy, and exactly what we needed to pierce the earth past the 4-foot safety barrier. When we drove back toward Evergreen Memorial Park, the scene was already changing. We saw police cars blocking the main highway exit leading to the cemetery. A news helicopter was circling overhead. Peterson's frantic call, combined with the sight of the overturned backhoe, must have finally triggered an emergency response. We took the back way, cutting through the municipal woods adjacent to the cemetery's perimeter wall, the same wall I had leaned against yesterday. The air in the woods was thick and still. The trees were unnaturally quiet. We parked the cart about a quarter-mile from Section G. We loaded the salt bags and the heavy auger onto a small wagon and started hauling it through the underbrush. As we neared the stone perimeter wall, we saw the damage. The heavy century-old stone wall was no longer just leaning. It was fractured. Huge sections had been pushed outward, creating wide, jagged openings. The ground inside the cemetery was expanding, forcing the structure to yield. We slipped through a gap in the wall, stepping back onto the 50 acres of silent, waiting death. The cemetery was no longer rippling gently. It was a landscape of frozen chaos. The peace garden was a muddy swamp, the grass ripped up in massive clumps. In the main section, the mausoleums were listing even further, one of them having completely collapsed into a pile of marble rubble. The ground was rigid now, hard-packed and still, but it felt wrong, like the surface of a drum stretched too tight. The silence was overwhelming, the kind of silence that precedes a massive storm. "It knows we're here," Frank muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's waiting for us to make the first move." We dragged the auger and the salt bags through the ravaged landscape, heading toward Section G. We had to move slowly, stepping carefully over fissures and deep depressions that had opened in the earth. The soil looked like dark, disturbed muscle. We reached Silas Thorne's plot. It was in the oldest, darkest corner of the cemetery, the spot where I had first seen the moss breathe. The ground here was different. It wasn't hard and rigid. It was soft and spongy, like walking on a rotting mattress. This was the nucleus. We found the grave marker, a massive plain granite slab, half sunk into the earth. "Right here, Mike," Frank said, setting down the wagon. "We drill right next to the headstone. The core is deep, but it should be concentrated here." We assembled the auger. It was heavy, awkward, and designed to tear through dirt, not the rubbery, dense mass we expected to find. Frank poured gasoline into the tank and pulled the starter cord. The auger roared to life, a deafening sound of metallic aggression that instantly shattered the oppressive silence. The moment the machine started, the ground responded. It wasn't a slow movement this time. It was an instantaneous, violent lurch. The earth around us bucked, throwing us both off balance. "Go! Go!" Frank screamed, wrestling the massive drill into position. We positioned the bit next to the headstone. I gripped the handles, fighting the torque of the machine, and Frank threw his weight onto the frame. The drill bit spun, biting into the spongy earth. First foot, easy, topsoil and decay. Second foot, tougher, tightly packed roots. Third foot. The drill started screaming, shaking violently. We were hitting the dense organic mass, the body of the blight. The ground around us began to rise in sharp, fast mounds. Tendrils, thicker and darker than the ones that had attacked the backhoe, erupted from the soil 15 feet away, whipping through the air like angry vipers. They weren't aiming for us yet. They were aiming for the noise. They slammed into the thick oak trees surrounding Section G, tearing off bark and splintering branches in an explosion of wood chips. 4 feet, Mike! Get past 4 feet! Frank yelled, his face contorted with effort as he held the auger steady. I leaned harder, the smell of burnt gasoline and damp earth filling my lungs. The machine fought me, trying to twist itself free. Then the auger bit through. At exactly 4.5 feet, the resistance vanished. The drill plunged suddenly, dropping half a foot into a hollow void. A blast of cold, stale air rushed up from the hole, carrying a sharp, acrid scent, the smell of industrial chemicals and old salt. We had breached the core. "Stop it! Pull it out!" Frank screamed. I cut the engine. The silence was instantaneous, broken only by the frantic thrashing of the tendrils nearby. We looked down at the dark, perfectly circular hole, maybe 10 inches wide, leading into the earth. The tendrils stopped attacking the trees. They went absolutely still, swaying slowly in the air, all focused on the sound of the cut engine and the sight of the open breach. "They know," Frank whispered, grabbing the first bag of rock salt. "They know we hit the poison." The ground beneath us began to pulse again, but not rhythmically. It was a rapid, frantic vibration, like a creature in agony. We grabbed the bags of salt and lime. This was the most dangerous part. We had to stand right over the open wound and pour the poison in. "I'll cover you," Frank said, grabbing a long-handled spade. "When it comes for us, I'll try to smack the tendrils away. You dump everything." I didn't argue. I grabbed a bag of road salt, tore it open, and knelt over the hole. I started pouring. The white granules cascaded into the darkness. The moment the salt hit the hidden core, the blight erupted. The earth beneath my knees exploded upward. I was thrown backward, landing hard on my back. A massive brown, segmented plate, like a huge piece of chitinous armor, burst through the ground where I had been kneeling. It slammed down, missing the hole by inches, and then began to rise again, hinged on one side, revealing a gaping maw lined with those horrifying pale teeth. The tendrils, thick as tree trunks now, shot out, aiming directly for Frank, who was standing between me and the hole. Frank didn't run. He swung the spade like a madman, connecting with one of the thick roots. The spade bent, but the root recoiled slightly, covered in a sticky brown fluid. "Keep pouring, Mike. Don't stop," Frank yelled, ducking under a second, faster strike. I scrambled back to the hole, ignoring the throbbing in my ribs. I ripped open a second bag of lime, the fine white powder billowing into the air. I poured it all in, followed by the pool shock, a concentrated chemical agent. The ground was screaming now, a low, grinding sound that wasn't audible, but felt through the soles of my feet and deep in my bones. The entire 50 acres seemed to be convulsing in pain. The massive mouth near the headstone snapped wildly, trying to close the breach. Frank was fighting for his life. A tendril wrapped around his left arm, jerking him violently off his feet. He dropped the spade and crashed into the ground, letting out a strangled cry. "Frank!" I screamed, dumping the last bag of salt. I finished the final bag, tossing the empty plastic aside. The hole was full of white, caustic powder. I grabbed the heavy jackhammer bit from the auger and charged toward Frank. The tendril was squeezing his arm, the skin already turning purple. Frank was kicking desperately, trying to reach his pocket knife. I swung the heavy steel bit like a club, aiming for the spot where the tendril connected to the earth. I hit it with all my strength. The root didn't break, but it spasmed violently, momentarily loosening its grip on Frank. Frank scrambled free, rolling away, clutching his injured arm. The blight turned its full attention to me. The segmented jaw opened wide, revealing the dense white interior and the rows of teeth. I backed away, stumbling over the discarded bags. The massive, dark tendrils reared up, preparing to strike. But then, the chemical poison hit the core. The grinding scream of the blight intensified into a final, horrific, shuddering roar. The entire cemetery convulsed. It wasn't a ripple. It was a seismic jolt. I was thrown to my knees. The mausoleums we had seen tilting finally succumbed, collapsing into dust clouds miles away. The segmented jaw snapped shut with a sound that cracked the air, and then the entire structure went rigid. The tendrils froze in midair, dark and slick, like statues suddenly carved from obsidian. Then, slowly, agonizingly, the tendrils began to retract. They didn't sink into the earth. They curled in on themselves, dissolving, shrinking back into the hole we had drilled. The dark, sticky fluid oozed back into the ground, leaving the surface dry and cracked. The ground beneath us went cold, deeply, unnaturally cold. The vibration vanished. The noise stopped. Absolute, profound silence returned to Evergreen Memorial Park. Frank and I lay there for a long time, gasping for breath, listening to the silence. My body ached, my clothes were shredded, and my hands were blistered, but we were alive. Frank slowly pushed himself up, his left arm hanging uselessly. He looked at the hole, now sealed by the collapsed earth and the white residue of the salt. "It's done," Frank whispered. "It's back to sleep." We didn't linger. We knew the police and the media would be swarming the area soon. They would find the overturned backhoe, the mangled car, and the collapsed mausoleums. They would find the cracked asphalt and the shattered perimeter wall. They would find the evidence of a massive, inexplicable disaster, but they wouldn't find us. We dragged ourselves back to the utility cart, leaving the auger, the wagon, and all the tools behind. We drove away through the woods, away from the sirens that were already closing in on the main gate. We didn't talk much on the drive. Frank's arm was definitely broken, and I felt like I'd been beaten with a baseball bat. We drove until we reached a diner 50 miles south of Albany, a place where no one knew us. We sat in a booth sipping lukewarm coffee, watching the national news on the small television screen above the counter. The headlines were massive. Mystery disaster at Evergreen, Memorial Park, sinkhole swallows, mausoleums, car. The anchors spoke of geological instability, subterranean gas explosions, and a horrific, localized earthquake. They showed footage of the wrecked cemetery, now surrounded by hazmat teams and National Guard troops. They mentioned the missing foreman, Mr. Peterson, presumed crushed in the disaster. They also mentioned 2 missing maintenance workers, Frank and Mike. Frank looked at me, his eyes tired and knowing. "We don't go back, Mike," he said softly. "Evergreen is sealed again, and we are gone." We left the diner and drove further south. We ditched the utility cart hundreds of miles away in a town where it would look like just another discarded piece of equipment. We took the cash we had saved up, the money I was supposed to use to get out of my parents' basement, and started a new life, far from the cold, damp earth of upstate New York. I never cut grass again. Sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I feel a phantom vibration in my hands, the slow, terrible thump-thump of the earth breathing. I know it's just my nerves, but it's enough to keep me awake. Frank and I stayed in touch, though we live in different states now. He works construction, never complaining about his permanently stiff arm. We never talk about the blight, or Peterson, or the cemetery, but the secret is always there. We know that beneath 50 acres of manicured lawn, under thousands of markers dedicated to the peaceful rest of the dead, there is something enormous, ancient, and deeply hostile. It's not gone, it's just sleeping, poisoned and inert, waiting for the salt to dissolve again. And I know with chilling certainty that one day, decades from now, some new young groundskeeper will be working late in the old section, trimming the ivy around a forgotten headstone. They will feel a slight vibration in the dirt, and they will wonder what in God's name could possibly be making the ground breathe. And the cycle will begin again. But that's their story now. Mine ended the day I realized I wasn't just cutting grass for the dead, I was maintaining the lid on a giant, hungry grave. And I got out, carrying nothing but the terror, the memory, and the cold, hard knowledge that some things are buried for a very good reason.